Good morning and welcome. We're so excited to have you here. My name is Ali. I work on Firebase, and I'm product manager on performance monitoring.
Everyone, I'm Jason. I'm a product manager on Firebase, and I work on Crashlytics.
And I'm Tali. I'm an engineering manager on Firebase, and I work on Crashlytics. Thanks so much for coming today. We're really excited to talk to you about how to improve your app's quality and stability using Firebase tools. But we want to start at the beginning. So you've got a great idea, and you start to code it up. You're spending a lot of time making sure that your app is working, you're debugging, you're showing your friends, and it's a really exciting part of the journey. But how many people here have experienced users churning because of a bad experience once an app ships to the App Store? Yeah, it's happened to me too, and it's really frustrating. And our metrics show that it's a big problem. 42% of one-star reviews in the App Store specifically mention stability and bugs. This means that users are taking notice when these problems exist in their apps, and they're making note of them in the App Store, which is going to make it harder for you to get and grow new users. Not only that, but 62% of users uninstall an app after a bad experience like this. And in many of those cases, that's after a first-time bad experience. So you can imagine this makes a huge difference in your ability to make your app a business. On the flip side, 73% of 5-star reviews in the App Store actually mention speed, design, and usability. So users really appreciate when this is delightful in an app, and they call it out. And that's really exciting. And when it comes to app quality, the first step is making sure that your app is thoroughly tested before you ever release to the App Store. And Firebase Test Lab is your best friend when it comes to that. As we announced yesterday, Firebase Test Lab is now available cross-platform on both iOS and Android, which is super exciting. And we really rely on it heavily because we know testing is important, but it can be really hard. And it doesn't have to be, because Test Lab does all the heavy lifting for you. With over 1,000 devices ranging in different device models, screen sizes, OSs, it's able to cover all of the different use cases, so you don't need to worry about it. And there's the new accessibility report. So it's not just testing whether or not your app is stable or crashing, it's actually helping you understand if it's usable, which is super cool. And it's really easy to get started. All you have to do is drag and drop your app binary, and you're able to get out-of-the-box tests right away without having to write any code. And those tests will help you understand your performance, like startup time, as well as crashes, and a lot more, so that you're able to be confident in your app's performance before you ever ship to the App Store. But we know that's only the beginning of the story, right? Because it's pretty hard to catch everything before it goes out to users. And we feel proud that users have trusted Crashlytics for more than 6 years as your partner in understanding how stable your app is. Crashlytics is running on Crashlytics is now generally available in Firebase, which is really exciting. It's our new home, and we're really looking forward to having closer ties with the other Firebase tools available to make it the best possible experience for users. Crashlytics is running on over 3 billion devices worldwide. And that's pretty amazing, because it means we're seeing a huge range of crash data across the world. But what does it mean in terms of the data that we're processing? Well, let's take a look. We process about 1.5 million events every second. OK, that's about 2 billion events per day. What does it look like in terms of users actually using an app that's crashing? So imagine we're all here in sunny California, and your phone crashes 7 times while you're walking around the conference. That'd be pretty frustrating. There's a very good chance you're going to uninstall that app, and there's a pretty good chance you're going to tell all your friends that it's terrible and not to use it. Now imagine every person in the United States had a mobile phone, and it crashed 7 times today. That is equivalent to the amount of data we are processing in our system every single day. It is a lot of data, and it's really hard to understand what you need to pay attention to. Not only that, but when you get a crash from the device, it looks like this. It's pretty hard to understand, right? Maybe if you look really closely, you'll see some things that highlight your app, but it's hard to figure out where to even get started. So Crashlytics takes all that data and all this information from the device, and we put it into a beautiful dashboard that makes it easy for you to understand what you need to focus on first. We have our crash-free user statistic at the top, which is the industry standard to understand how your app is doing. We also have your session list, your issue list, which allows you to see right away what needs your attention. It shows you significant bits of information, like if a certain OS is seeing this issue more than others, if there are specific devices that have this problem, and so you're able to know right off the bat what needs your attention. When you dig in further, you're able to see how this issue is trending across different versions, as well as the blame frame, where we think you should really start your debugging process. It allows you to go confidently into triaging of an issue so that you're able to solve it quickly and help resolve it and get your users onto a better path fast. But we know you can't always be at your computer, right? It's not really possible. So we've got your back no matter where you are, with real-time emails that let you know if there's a stability issue with new issue, regress issue, or velocity alerts. So no matter where you are, we've got your back. And now I'm going to pass it over to Ali, who's obsessed with performance on our team.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thanks. So as you heard from Tali, clearly app stability plays a huge role in how your users perceive your app. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't just stop there. Users are also known to have a very short attention span. They expect a highly performant and smooth experience. And for this exact reason, we went to work last year to build Firebase Performance Monitoring, which we actually announced this time at I/O last year at the same stage. It is an SDK that supports both iOS and Android, and it allows you to report a lot of data about how your app performs from the point of view of your users. Now, if you've used performance monitoring before, you probably know that in addition to being able to instrument things that are custom to your app, you also get a lot of data out of the box just by installing the SDK. You'll get things like the network activity between your app and the backends that it uses. So we'll report for you things like how often your endpoints fail or what response latencies your users are experiencing. And we do that for any backends, whether it's third-party SDKs you have in your app or your own managed services. We also report for you app start duration, which is a key metric because it ties into that first impressions that your users get. And as of yesterday, we started reporting rendering data. So now we tell you how often your app drops a frame and where this happens. Now, this is pretty important for any developer, but if you're a Play developer, it is especially important. If you have an app on the Play Store, you probably know that last year the Play Developer Console introduced this new section called Android Vitals. And what it does is report a number of metrics that are key to your success. Naturally, some of these metrics are performance metrics. You see an example right here. In this case, it's slow rendering. And there's a similar metric called frozen frame. And they're both about how smoothly your animations and your app in general renders. Now, for these metrics, we've heard a consistent piece of feedback from our developers. People love to have this data, but they don't know how to act on it and where exactly in the app this happens. And that's exactly where Firebase Performance comes in. Because not only do we now report these metrics out of the box, but we also do it per screen. So if you're Android, we'll show you the number of frozen frames or slow frames per Android activity. And also for iOS, we do the same thing. We show you these numbers per UI view controllers. So you get a lot of extra context this way to help you get started on fixing the issue. We'll see an example of how this works in a second. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the reception that we've seen with Firebase Performance. The last time we talked about this was back in October at the Firebase Dev Summit in Amsterdam, and we were super excited to tell you that we were processing as many as 30 billion performance events per day. And since then, only 6 months later, this number has grown to 100 billion events per day. So we couldn't be more excited about the trajectory we're seeing and about the quality of the feedback and the reception that our developers has given to us. So please keep it coming. It'll only help us make the product better. Now, as you can imagine, this is a lot of data to go through. And if you're a developer that's looking to improve their app, this can be a little bit intimidating. It can be a lot of data to sift through. And because of that, our console is now getting better. We now have a new feature called the issue feed, which helps you identify the top performance issues you have, and it appears right at the top of the main page in the performance console. So we'll tell you things like how often your endpoints fail or if your app start is slow, so that you can spend much less time sifting through that data and more time acting on it and fixing issues. And finally, if you were around for the Firebase session yesterday, you heard that Firebase performance is now generally available. We have exited beta as of yesterday, and we're really excited about how battle-tested our SDKs are on both iOS and Android, and about the overall value our developers have found with performance monitoring. So if you haven't tried it so far, now would be a great time to do so. All right, so let's get to the fun part. I'm going to invite Tali back on stage so that she can tell us how we got to use all these products in building one of our own apps. Tali.
Thanks. So you just heard a good overview of these different products, but we really wanted to talk about how this actually looks in an app and how it works with the timeline as you build and release your application. We're going to specifically focus on the Firebase App Quality tools, but it's worth noting that FriendlyPix uses a lot of other Firebase tools like functions, databases, storage, and auth. So it's got a lot of goodness in there, and you can check out the code for yourself. FriendlyPix allows you to take a photo and upload it and share it with your friends. Here's Jason taking a picture of his dog Percy, which he does a lot, and putting a little caption with it and sharing it. So it's pretty simple. And our first step was making sure that it was well tested. We partnered and used TestLab really heavily to make sure that this worked well and we could ship confidently. And when we looked at our dashboard, we noticed that there was a problem right away. We saw that a test was failing. And this was pretty surprising to us because we had all been playing with the app and we hadn't seen any problems. We were able to go to the Videos tab and see a simulation of this crash actually happening on a device, which was super helpful in debugging the problem. You can see here that we're uploading a photo. Oh, OK. And it's freezing, and then it crashes. So that was really important to catch early and make sure that we had a good experience for users. This allowed us to ship to the App Store with confidence because we knew we were going to have a good experience for our users. Now I'm going to pass it off to Jason, who's keeping an eye on stability for FriendlyPix.
Thanks. All right. So I want to walk you through a real scenario that happened shortly after we shipped FriendlyPix. So I went in to upload a photo, most likely of Percy, which I'm actually super excited you all got to see a picture of. And the app crashed for me. And it actually crashed immediately on launching it, which was surprising because, as we discussed, we tested it manually, we ran it through TestLab, and things were pretty smooth, and we hadn't shipped any recent changes. So I immediately log in, I go to Crashlytics, and I notice there's a huge drop in crash-free users. So clearly not just me that's experiencing this crash. And it's attributed to one specific issue. So I dive in to see what's going on here. I can see a big spike, obviously, with this issue. And I look at what's going on, and something to do with empty list in our user dictionary. So I talked to other folks on our team to see what's going on, and what we realized is the web team shipped a change that was allowing users, authors, to upload a photo without a username. They weren't setting it to null. And our iOS client was expecting null in those scenarios, so it was causing a crash. And for me, it was crashing immediately on launch because that was the first post that was trying to load. So a pretty simple fix. We made the iOS app more resilient to non-null. We shipped a change to make sure that the web client was setting those scenarios to null. And we documented what happened. So Crashlytics has a great feature called Notes. So in Notes, I can document exactly what I just walked through to tell other members of our team what was going on, how we fixed it, why we fixed it. And this is really great to make sure you don't sort of relive some of the same mistakes. If you use a bug tracking system, you can put a ticket in there. You see we capture the bug, put it away. Hopefully it doesn't regress and escape. But that's good, so we're all set for now. And the next thing I want to do, or I did, is make sure that that change actually was fixed. So you can see here that I'm pinning 1.1, which is the recent version that we just shipped to the App Store. And pin builds is a really great feature in Crashlytics because if you're one of those development teams that's always churning out QA builds or beta builds or local builds, you may have a long list of versions. And by pinning the most relevant ones to top, you can really get access to the ones that are in the App Store, so it's easy to keep those top of mind. So I filtered onto that. Noticed that there are still a few issues I need to deal with, but luckily that prevalent one that we just fixed is no longer there. So what I want to make sure here, what I wanted to make sure is that that never happened again, where I was the one that kind of tested and found out what was going on, or maybe someone on my team. I want to know about it right away. And maybe I wasn't paying attention to the emails that Tali was mentioning, but I do spend a lot of time in Slack. So maybe as you heard yesterday in the What's New in Firebase talk, in the Integrations tab in Firebase, we now have the ability to configure Slack. So we definitely wanted to take advantage of this. So it's super easy. You just need to copy and paste your Slack webhook URL, set the channel you want the notifications to go to. So in our case, it's the Friendly Picks iOS room, which is where my team's monitoring this. And I want all the alerts on. I want new issues, I want regressed issues, and I want velocity alerts. And a velocity alert is when one issue is causing a significant portion of all your sessions to crash. So that's something you definitely want to pay attention to. And this issue we just fixed probably would have triggered a velocity alert. So hopefully I don't get one of those in the future, but if I do, at least I know it'll come through in Slack where I'm spending a lot of my time and paying attention. What I'm going to do now is turn it back up to Ali, who's going to tell us about what's going on with performance while we were debugging this.
All right. Cool. So I'm kind of curious myself how performance is going. So we'll stay in the Firebase console, but this time switch over to the performance page. And when we land there, the first thing that I see under the dashboard tab is a number of high-level metrics about how my app is performing. So I see things like the duration of different parts of the app, network success rate over the last 30 days, network response latency by country, and so on. What I'm really curious about, though, is how Friendly Picks is performing on device. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that tab. And when I do that, I see a couple of sections. The first one, durations, tell me things like how long app start is taking. In this case, it's 2.4 seconds, and it sounds about reasonable. The second section I see here is the rendering data. This is the new feature that I was talking about. And if you look at it, you can see that there's a couple of metrics being reported here: slow frames and frozen frames. Slow frames are basically any frames that take more than 16 milliseconds to render, and therefore deviate from that ideal 60 frames per second standard that we always want to have in our animations. Frozen frames, on the other hand, are frames that take more than 700 milliseconds, and therefore create this noticeable freeze that interrupts the user flow. And for each one of these two metrics, we report the values per screen. So since we're dealing with an iOS app in this case, we see it per UI view controller. And if you look closely, you can see that the animation view controller specifically has a higher percentage of slow frames compared to other screens. So this is obviously not a great thing, and I want to look into it a bit more. So I'm going to click on it, and I land on this details page that details out the characteristics of slow frame rendering for that screen. And I can see that the breakdown of versions that I have, this part that I see at the top left of the page, shows me that there's no significant difference between the last few app versions. So this is not necessarily a regression that got introduced because of my latest code. But if I scroll down, I can see a breakdown of the percentage of slow frames by a number of attributes, by things like which devices the users were on, which app versions they were using, and which countries they were based in. And specifically for device, I can see a couple of warnings on the iPhone 5 and the iPad Air. And they tell me that these two devices specifically have a much higher percentage of slow frames compared to other devices. Now, this kind of makes sense. These are older devices, and I would expect that their rendering is not going to be as smooth as some of the newer ones. But the cool thing here is that using this data, I can specifically target these devices and give them a different treatment. So for instance, I can show less animations or no animations for these users so that they can have an overall better experience. And just like that, we found our first insight using the console data, and we dealt with it by having a targeted experience. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and ship this fix. And now we can see that our app is growing. It's expanding to new users and new markets We're getting a lot of reviews coming in. A lot of them are good reviews, which is a great thing. But I want to jump back into the performance console and see how things are. And when I do that, I notice that there's an issue now that popped up that I did not have before. And this issue tells me that my image service has been taking longer to respond in the last few days. If I click on it, I can see a detailed overtime chart that shows that over the last 7 days or so, there has been a significant percentage of samples that have exceeded the network threshold we have, which is 2 seconds. This is the default network threshold that we have. You can always tweak this if it doesn't make sense for your specific use case. But in here, we're not going to do that. We're going to stick with the default threshold and try to examine why this is happening. Now, if I scroll down and look at my breakdowns, I can see that users in India have been specifically experiencing higher network latencies compared to other users. Now, I have a theory on why this might be happening. I think this is happening because this is an image service. We have not been using image compression so far, and therefore, users with typically slower data connections will just have a harder time fetching these images. But how do I actually make sure that my hypothesis is correct? The answer, obviously, is an experiment. So I'm going to jump back into my code, and I'm going to create a custom trace called image fetch and have it trap the logic that I use to fetch these images. And for that trace, called image fetch, I'm going to set a custom attribute, call it compression, and turn it on and off depending on which variant of the experiment you're in. Now I'm going to ship this code, and a couple days later, I'll jump back into the console and check out the details I have for the image fetch trace that I just created. And I can see that in addition to the traditional breakdowns that I have, I also now have a tab for compression, this custom attribute that I just added. And I can see that the difference in performance, specifically in network latency, is huge between the cases where compression is on and compression is off. So now I have the data that I need to make sure that compression is the right fix, and I can go ahead and roll it out to every user. So the cool thing here is that not only did we find out about an issue using our console when we didn't know that it existed, but we also used the console to monitor the effects of the fix and make sure that it had the intended effects. But now, it looks like we have a new Slack notification that is complaining about a new fatal crash. So I'm going to let Jason take a look at this. Jason?
Thank you. OK, so it's a bummer we got a crash, but great that I immediately knew about this. So clicking through from Slack takes me directly into the issue details page. So I notice a few things immediately about this issue that are a little bit unique. One is that it's not in my main app code. The problem is actually in a system library, photo library services. And the second thing is that there's a bit of data up at the top. And this is what we call a crash insight. And a crash insight is actually a solution to what's going on here. So as Tali mentioned earlier, we get billions of crashes a day. And as you could imagine, not every single one of those crashes is unique to each application. Many of those crashes are common across thousands of applications. And typically, those common crashes are either programming errors or issues in third-party libraries or issues in this system framework. And in our case, what we're doing wrong is we're trying to access the camera roll to upload a photo before the user's explicitly granted permission. So maybe this is API misuse or race condition. Either way, it's a common error that many other developers are experiencing, and I know exactly how to solve it right here. There's documentation that points to what I'm doing wrong and how to address it. So huge time saver, saved us a lot of time debugging, Googling, looking through documentation. So if you get a crash and it has an insight on it, I definitely recommend you take a peek and make sure that you read up on what it's telling you to do, because it could save you a ton of time as well. Now, if this crash didn't have an insight on it, there was another great integration that you could have used for free out of the box with Crashlytics. Is what we call breadcrumbs. So Crashlytics automatically integrates with Google Analytics for Firebase. And when a crash occurs, we send through all the events that were recorded in that session. So what the actions the user is doing. So you can see here there's a bunch of screen views. And the last thing in this session was the user tried to access the image picker controller, which actually makes sense, because if you think back to the crash, or what the problem was that the insight was telling us, is that we were trying to access the camera roll before they granted permission. So even if we didn't have the insight onto this crash, we could have probably retraced the user's steps with breadcrumbs and got ourselves into that same scenario. So these are two really great things that you get out of the box with Crashlytics to help you debug. But with Friendly Picks, what we wanted to do is step up our debugging game by adding a little bit more metadata, adding a little bit more code to the app. And one of those things we used was what we call custom keys. Now, you can think of custom keys as like contextual cues to what's going on in the application. So maybe that's the level of the game, level equals 10. Maybe for some reason that's a really buggy level. Or how many items the user has stored in the shopping cart. Because maybe those are indicative of what's going on and what the problem is with the application. And in our case, we actually had a hunch that there was something going on with what we thought the indexes of posts were in the database versus locally on the device when we were trying to delete them. We thought something was getting out of sync and causing a crash. So we wanted to understand that context. So we instrumented custom keys. So here's an example, one line of code where we're logging the key in our listen deletes function. And the same thing in our updates deletes function. And this code's all available on GitHub, so you can download it and take a look at it in its entirety, but I just wanted to highlight here how simple that was. And it shows up in Crashlytics like this. So kind of right in the same area, you see the stack trace and the breadcrumbs. You can see the keys, and you can see what we thought at the time of the crash was for the index in the database and locally. And this actually really helped us debug a super tricky crash. So something I recommend taking advantage of for yourselves when you want to know context of what's going on when the app's crashing. Now, another thing we used was what's called user identifier. And this is something that your customer support team will really, really, really like. So setting user identifiers is similar to custom keys, one line of code. And it shows up in Crashlytics like this. Now, that might not look super useful at first, but what you can do is you can map that user ID to the user that's logged in or using your application so that when someone writes in to customer support and says, hey, I'm having a bad experience, or the app always crashes to me when I try to do X, Y, or Z, you can actually rectify their situation. Maybe retrace their steps with breadcrumbs, issue them a refund, tell them they need to update their version, turn a negative experience into a positive experience for your users, and really supercharge your debugging capabilities. So those are a few extra things you can do in addition to the out-of-the-box insights and breadcrumbs with custom keys and user IDs for Crashlytics. But what I'm going to do now is turn it back over to Tali to review everything we did to improve the performance and stability of Friendly Picks.
Thanks. So that was our full journey, and we know it was just one example of what this could look like for all of you. We started with coming up with an idea and coding up an app. It was really exciting. We partnered early with Firebase Test Lab to make sure that we had a high-quality experience and we could ship to the App Store with confidence. After we shipped to the App Store, we depended heavily on Firebase Crashlytics and performance to make sure we had the best possible experience. We were able to alert to new issues quickly, triage and resolve them fast. We saw growth of our app and expanded to new markets. And we dug in deeper with advanced features. We did all of this so that you could focus on what you really want to focus on most, which is building new features and delighting your users. We know that no one wants to spend their day worrying about the quality and stability of their app. And that's why we have created these tools, so that we're able to have your back so that you can focus on what you want to do most. We also have your back when it comes to security and privacy. We're excited by May 25th, we will be fully GDPR compliant, so you can continue to serve your users no matter where they are in the world, because we know that's really important. Thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate your time. If you want to dig in deeper with Test Lab, there's another session tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. on autonomous and customized pre-launch testing. It should be really cool, so be sure to check it out. Thank you so much.